I'm Jim Clendenen, and I'm the mind behind Au Bon Climat winery, which I founded in 1982 in Santa Barbara County, California, and moved to the north in the Santa Maria Valley in 1989. Nothing. The first experimental plantings were in the late 60s. The majority of interesting plantings were made in the early 70s. At the very beginning, they've all been replanted, of course. We got there in 77, got a chance to sort of see the development and evolution. People thought it was a good area for Cabernet Sauvignon. That was probably an error at the time, so our early wines were a little bit weird, a little earthy and herbal, as it were, as they found in Monterey County and in San Luis Obispo County also. But we found out that Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and obviously Syrah a little bit later, were among the grapes that did very well in a cool climate, struggled to ripeness, had bright acidity, great balance, and a lot of elegance to them. The clones weren't proper, everything was planted naturally rooted, and it turned out that when phylloxera began to threaten and we started playing around with rootstocks, we discovered that very small vines that were heavily devigorated, planted in larger numbers than we had in the past, so between 1,700 and 2,000 vines per acre instead of 500 vines per acre, and with interesting clones recently developed at the University of Dijon by Professor Raymond Barnard back in the 70s, and also some old FPMS material that Davis had, planting a combination of those things with high density and north-south row orientations, and we didn't have to do any work anymore. The grapes were so good that all we had to do was keep them cool, crush them, let them ferment on their own, and then 14 days later put them down in barrels, bottle them 18 months later with very little work, and our wines were delicious. So it was a question of having the wrong material in the beginning but in the right area, and now that we have the right material in a very interesting climate zone for Pinot Noir, I think even the future is going to be better than it is right now. 1974, I went over to France. I went to Bordeaux. It was a junior year abroad from UC Santa Barbara. And in Bordeaux, you have to be a duke, a count, or a baron, and own 500 acres in a castle to make wine. In 77, after graduating from school in pre-law, I went to Burgundy. And in Burgundy, it was very clear to me that you could have very few rows of vineyards. You could have a tractor and enough room to make 36 barrels of wine in your cellar and be just as important as the next guy who was down the street. So I was motivated to try to make my way in the world of wine. I started working in the late 70s at Zaca Mesa. I went down to Australia. California taught me the possibility of making wine in the New World. Australia taught me the technical aspects of winemaking that were a little bit interesting to me at the time, not so much now. And then after that, I went back to France and worked in Burgundy in 1981 and found out all that I needed to do. Very, very rudimentary winemaking involving barrels, lees components, not a lot of settling or over-processing, and if you took good grapes in balance, you could make a very delicious wine. And we've taken that premise and expanded on it over the last 28 years and discovered, of course, the majority of the effort that you have to make Burgundian style wines where you're not working hard in the cellar occurs in the vineyard. Careful farming, leaf exposure, fruit exposure by leaf removal, getting a chance to get direct sunlight to your clusters, and relatively high density competitive farming to allow the roots to go deep in well-drained soils, and then harvesting in balance. My whole goal is not to chaptalize, not to acidulate, and certainly not to water back our vineyards, our grapes after they're harvested from the vineyard. And so the intention is to make balanced wines of elegance and aromatic intensity, wonderful texture, positive flavors, instead of trying to make wines that are powerful and blind tasting winners. And I think we've done that, which makes us a traditional European-oriented winemaking organization that makes wines to drink, not to taste, and to drink copiously. We believe in starting early and continuing on when it comes to drinking. If you have wine that is very, very forward, made in an oxidative style with 16% alcohol, it's not going to have a long life. But when you make wines like we make wines that have bright fruit, good complexity and earthiness, they finish their malolactic fermentation, and they've been bottled in a gentle fashion, they tend to age, I think, quite well. We argue that 6 or 7 years after the date on the vintage, the wines have opened up and begun to express their personality, and then they seem to hold like that for 10 to 15 more years minimum. We had an 85 from me last week that was in great condition from a difficult vintage. It was a high crop vintage. I was very happy with that. And an 89 Magnum that I'm running out of the wine, unfortunately, from Sanford and Benedict Vineyard, but looked like it had 20 more years that it could age, which is maybe the most long-lived wine we've made. So I think that as long as I can buy great wines made by great friends in Burgundy, that'll probably satisfy that goal. But that was a goal for a very long period of time. I've stopped consulting. I've been approached by people on virtually every continent at different times, and I've done it down in New Zealand, and I've done it a little bit in South Africa, and in places as funny as Sancerre, Puy-Fumé, and the Alto Adige in Italy. And I don't get a lot of satisfaction from that anymore, because if people don't have information, you can give them information and bring them up to speed, but to wholesale change something and make it greater rather than giving it the appearance of greatness is a far more difficult, troubling, and problematic kind of a thing. So, we've tended to focus more at home, which is great. If I had one dream, if I had one thing that I could live later on in my life, I'd love to see my 11-year-old son become the winemaker heir apparent to me. I don't want to intimidate him by this living legend bullshit that he has to hear all the time. People walk up and put their arm around this 11-year-old who's very, very, very interested in wine, and he's very interested in following in my footsteps. But they sit there and go, you know how hard it's going to be to follow in the footsteps of this man? And I'm sitting there going, man, the kid's going to be 17 and totally freaked out about it. But I'd love to see him take up a life of winemaking and take the basis that I've laid for him with the vineyards that I planted and make it into something even more special than I've had. I'm not unless he tries to make 17% alcohol port-like Pinot Noir, and then I'm going to smack him in the head, because I see all these youngsters in Burgundy taking over from their parents and having a lot of fights over it. But a lot of the modernization they want to do isn't really quality-oriented. And as long as my son wants to make something of higher quality than I've made, that would make me the proudest man on the planet. I was 21, living in France, and just fell in love with wine. And it was a challenging thing for me. So I didn't have a lot of money, but people would always say, you know so much about wine, what good does it do you? And I'd say, here's a good thing. And I'd go to a store and I'd buy a $2.75 Crozes Hermitage back in the 1970s while traveling in France. That was genius. And that's a great thing to know about. Everybody knows that Mouton's fantastic and Romanée-Conti's wonderful, but if you can't afford it, it doesn't do you any good. So at that point, it really greatly enhanced my life. I still spend more time thinking about what I'm going to prepare for lunch than I spend thinking, for instance, what shirt I'm going to put on, or where I'm going to buy my shoes, or if I want to go shopping. And that part of the food and wine aspect of life is to me the most fun. I enjoy having family meals. I enjoy having friends over for meals. I cook every day at the winery when I'm there for lunch, and that sort of conviviality with my employees is very important to me. And wine's what makes that whole thing work. I think at a party, when you look at people who are happily buzzed on the right amount of wine, you have the greatest moments of joy you can have among people. When you have the end of that party and some of the people are a little bit blitzed, maybe that's not the happiest ending to the party you can have. But that's what wine means to me. It's a daily consumption. I have it for lunch, and I have it for dinner every day, and it's been really good to me so far.
Okay, well, I actually have a half question. You talked about the $2.75 Crozes Hermitage. What's the deal that nobody knows about that they should in the stores right now?
That's an interesting question. That's a really interesting question.
Like you got that $5-10 in your pocket. What do you want to get?
I'm buying generic German Rieslings made by companies who are representing, that have been selling, the more expensive products, or I'm buying something from someone like Armand Biel or Willem Haag or Robert Weil, where they used to make just cabinet and up, and the wines sort of started at $35 and went really high. Now they got wines that are $15, $16 that are totally delicious. So look at a good vintage and do that. The great thing that I recommend everyone to shop for, which no one wants to shop for, in 09, for instance, people are going to run out and try to buy Chambertin for $500. Well, more power to them. But in 09, you can go out and buy yourself a Chory-les-Beaunes, or you can buy a Bourgogne, you can buy the cheapest, you can buy a Marsanne or a whatever Desange from the hills of Burgundy, an Haute Côte de Nuit wine, because everything got ripe then. That's totally inexpensive. That's under $20. That will be completely delicious. And so great vintages, lesser wines from well-known and established areas are phenomenal wines. Look for an 09 Cru Bourgeois or a Côte de Fronsac and pay less than $25, unless you're a billionaire, and then go out and buy Pavis de Cesse for $450 on futures.